Pennsylvania man Jeremy Pauley shocked the community when authorities received a tip about suspicious activities taking place at Pauley's residence. Upon obtaining a search warrant and entering his house, police stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Investigators found a collection of human body parts meticulously preserved and displayed throughout the premises. The fact that Pauley had been selling these body parts online was alarming, but most of them were acquired through legal means, such as medical research institutions and body donation programs. But police discovered that Pauley had also procured illegally obtained body parts as well. But not in an involuntarily illegal way, like filling bathtubs full of ice because you liked the way some stranger's arm looked the other day when you were at the food store. The extent of Pauley's online market was surprising. He had created an underground network where buyers could browse and purchase all sorts of body parts. These transactions took place on Facebook, where the morbid fascination of certain individuals fueled a lucrative trade. But if he wasn't just grabbing random body parts off of strangers, how was Pauley getting the parts? Among the other people implicated was Candace Chapman Scott, a woman whose occupation added another layer of horror to the story. Scott, a mortician, had managed to make nearly $11,000 through her involvement in the body parts trade, and her access to bodies provided her with a steady supply of inventory for Pauley's enterprise. The investigation uncovered incriminating Facebook messages between Scott and Pauley. The messages revealed their connection, with Scott and Pauley discussing orders for all sorts of body parts. The extent of their involvement and the number of customers they had reached was unexpected. Another key figure in this twisted operation was Cedric Lodge, who was previously employed as the morgue manager at Harvard University. Lodge is accused of stealing parts from donated bodies. Both Scott and Lodge shipped the parts to Pauley. Pauley was arrested and charged, and he was facing up to 15 years in prison. But he reached a plea deal at the end of June 2023, with the details not public as of the publishing of this video. Number 5. The Cancer Faker. Angie Emma Walsh from Adelaide, Australia, ran an elaborate scam that targeted unsuspecting victims, including members of the clergy. Over 2.5 years, Walsh claimed she had cancer and needed financial assistance for treatment. Through her lies, Walsh managed to swindle a significant amount of money from her victims before her scheme unraveled. Walsh preyed upon the goodwill and trust of her victims, which included a priest and a nun. Father Bill Brady and Sister Teresa Swiggs were among those who fell victim to Walsh's manipulative tactics. The trusting nun had played a pivotal role in connecting Walsh with her biological sister, Angela Robinson, who got scammed as well. Walsh's lies resulted in her amassing $184,151 from her victims. She exploited their generosity and compassion, taking advantage of their willingness to help someone in need. The money was intended to support her medical treatment, but instead, Walsh had other treatments in mind that were less medically necessary and more for funsies. She used the money for personal indulgences like vacations and trips to Gold Coast theme parks, including Dreamworld, SeaWorld, and Surfers Paradise. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Walsh's scam was the toll it took on Angela Robinson, who went to great lengths to help. Robinson not only gave Walsh her entire life savings, but also took out a loan to provide even more financial assistance. Robinson's commitment and trust serve as poignant reflections of the depth of Walsh's deception, but also what an incredible person Angela Robinson is. In total, Walsh faced more than 45 charges. It's also worth mentioning that Walsh had a history of similar offenses, which resulted in the revocation of suspended sentences and the imposition of a new sentence. The court recognized the extensive damage caused by Walsh's repeated deceptions, ultimately sentencing her to 5 years, 10 months, and 18 days in prison. She was also ordered to pay $20,000 in compensation, which was the maximum that a judge could order. It's weird to think how some people can completely drain a stranger's bank account just to go to SeaWorld and have a good time. We feel crazy guilty when we steal a parking spot. And this lady was like, let's go see those whales at SeaWorld. Number 4, taking advantage of dementia. Caregiver Debbie Newbury was at the center of a disturbing case involving the exploitation of a 94-year-old woman with dementia. The victim, Margaret Hartshorn, had been receiving care from Newbury for years. Newbury was originally employed by the family as a maid, but she later transitioned into a caregiving role, which seems like an odd decision. Taking advantage of her position, Newbury drained £45,000 from Margaret's bank account between October 2014 and November 2017. This amount of money was a significant blow to Margaret and her family, who were already struggling with the costs of dementia care. It was revealed that Newbury was making between £200 and £250 per week from her caregiving duties, and the ill-gotten gains were obtained through the fraudulent use of 36 checks over nearly 3 years. Some of the funds were even used to purchase a car. Newbury's activities finally came to light when bank staff raised concerns about transactions, leading to an investigation by Nottinghamshire police and subsequent reporting to social services. She was confronted with her crimes, admitted to the fraud, and was given 15 months in prison. The sentencing sparked outrage from Margaret's family. They believed that a 15-month prison term was way too lenient. In fact, the family had to resort to selling their home, which they owned for over 50 years, in order to continue paying for Margaret's care. The family was also upset because Newbury previously got a suspended sentence in 2010 for stealing jewelry from 2 homes where she worked as a maid. The family felt that her record should have been disclosed to them when she was first introduced as a potential caregiver for Margaret. But that's kind of the family's job, isn't it? They did hire a maid to be a caregiver when there's about 1 million qualified CNAs available. Number 3. Romanced again. Sajjad Hussain is a fraudster from the UK who used online dating sites to target vulnerable women. He introduced himself under different names and manipulated his victims into believing they were in real relationships. The women trusted him, went on dates with him, and even planned a future together. To gain sympathy and manipulate his victims, Hussain told stories about being a police officer, how his rich father had a skiing accident abroad before dying, and how his mother had breast cancer. The emotional leverage he used allowed him to extract money from these women, and Hussain treated them like human piggy banks. The impact on the victims was devastating. One woman used her family's gold heirlooms to raise money for Hussain, while others resorted to borrowing from their parents to fulfill his demands. Some suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and as a result, financial hardship became a reality for many. It was later discovered that Hussain was already married, further exposing his deception and betrayal. In total, he defrauded his victims of over £200,000, leaving them emotionally and financially scarred. One victim of Sajjad Hussain's fraud was compelled to resort to a high-interest loan in order to repay the funds she had borrowed. Another expressed living with an ongoing sense of fear and anxiety as her belief in a future with Hussain during a crucial period caused her to postpone having children until a later age. Eventually, Hussain was reported to the police and he was arrested at the home he lived in with his wife. During the investigation, it came to light that Hussain had a substantial gambling habit, with £135,000 spent on online gambling between 2013 and 2020. Hussain's guilty plea in court acknowledged his crimes and the devastating impact they had on his victims. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Number 2. The suspicious disappearance. Brian Walsh from Massachusetts found himself at the center of a mysterious and troubling series of events. It all began when his wife Anna disappeared on New Year's Day after failing to catch a work flight to Washington, D.C. She supposedly booked a rideshare car to the airport and hasn't been seen since. Adding to the intrigue, a few days later, a massive fire broke out at the Walsh's former family home, a lavish $1.4 million mansion in Cohasset. The fire started in the attic, and fortunately, the 3 adults and 1 child residing in the house at the time managed to escape unharmed. The Cohasset police chief stated that investigators would thoroughly examine the fire to determine its cause. Shady Brian Walsh has a bit of a criminal history. He's a convicted art swindler, and in 2021, he pleaded guilty to selling 2 fake Andy Warhol paintings for $80,000. Walsh obtained the paintings from a friend and sold them on eBay, but he surreptitiously switched them out for counterfeit works. Brian managed to sell the counterfeit Warhol paintings to a reputable art gallery owner, Ron Rivlin, the owner of Revolver Gallery in Los Angeles. Upon closer inspection, Rivlin discovered that the artworks lacked the necessary authentication stamps and appeared to be painted on new canvases. So, he immediately contacted Walsh, but his attempts to obtain a refund were met with excuses and delays. Eventually, only $30,000 of the $80,000 was refunded, so Rivlin decided to involve the FBI, which ultimately led to his guilty plea. Despite his criminal past, Brian Walsh initially cooperated with the investigation into his wife's disappearance, but along the way, some issues surrounding his mental health have come to light. A friend of Brian's late father claimed that Brian had been diagnosed as a sociopath and had been a long-term patient at a psychiatric center. Brian and his father, a former psychiatrist, had been estranged since 2009, and apparently, Walsh still tried to get cash off his father after he suffered a stroke. After his father passed away, Walsh was accused of stealing millions of dollars from his estate. Brian also didn't tell any of the other family members that his father had passed away. Instead, he stole heirlooms, including artwork from Salvador Dali and Joan Miro, and then tried to sell his father's estate for an inflated price, acting as the executor of the will despite not being legally allowed to do so. Brian's wife, according to court documents, indicated that she benefited from his fraudulent activities as he transferred $115,000 to her. The funds that came from his previous art fraud case were used for extravagant purchases, including shopping trips at Prada in France and paying off credit card debts for travel and restaurants. Eventually, Walsh was arrested on suspicion of misleading investigators in the search for his wife and was put in jail on a $500,000 bond. Surveillance footage showed him purchasing heavy-duty cleaning supplies despite claiming to have been home during the time his wife went missing. These findings point to potential involvement in his wife's disappearance and a disturbing turn of events, ultimately leading to his arrest on suspicion of his wife's untimely passing. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay tuned right here for the woman who loved doing crimes. Number 1. Detroit landlords. Detroit woman June Walker had just made the final payment on her house. She transformed the once dilapidated hovel into a cozy home for herself and her family. However, her joy was short-lived when an eviction letter arrived 2 months later. The man who'd negotiated the lease with Walker in 2019 turned out to be a scammer named Derek, and the money she'd been paying each month didn't go toward the purchase of her home. Walker became a victim of a scam that has affected numerous people in Detroit. This scam took advantage of the foreclosure crisis that hit the city. Con artists took advantage of this situation in various ways. Some, who lost their houses to the banks, continued to collect rent from tenants without telling them they no longer owned the property. Janelle Poydras, another victim of the scam, described the heart-wrenching experience of being locked out of his house, leaving him and his family in the streets. Tragically, his 2 puppies were trapped inside and froze. The housing market in Detroit was further complicated by the presence of blighted and vacant properties. Many homes required tons of work that exceeded their potential value. Scammers took advantage of this situation by breaking in and posing as the owners. When June Walker moved in, she attempted to transfer the utilities into her name, but encountered a problem when she discovered outstanding utility bills. Derek told her that she would need to pay them, and she had to endure several weeks without electricity or water before it was turned on. After spending her time and money renovating the home, Walker made her final payment and contacted Derek about transferring the deed into her name. He agreed to meet with her and said he would give her the deed, but then canceled the appointment. When Walker called to reschedule, his phone was disconnected. The scam thrived due to the lack of consequences, and Detroit's housing market was severely impacted by discriminatory lending practices, crumbling infrastructure, and limited access to banks. Many residents, particularly those from low-income communities, found it hard to obtain home loans. As a result, they turned to rent-to-own agreements. After Derek vanished, June Walker's concerns grew. She had a feeling that something was wrong, and eventually got a summons accusing her of trespassing and demanding her appearance in court. In disbelief, she double-checked the envelope, making sure it was addressed to her. She couldn't understand how such a mistake could happen. The real owner of Walker's home said he thought it was empty and claimed to have invested $15,000 in renovating the property back in 2018. When confronted with June Walker's description of the house's condition in 2019, he realized he'd also fallen victim to a fraudulent contractor who had billed him for work that was never completed. Due to the prevalence of housing scams, Detroit took action by launching a buyback program. The buyback program provided an opportunity for residents to reclaim their homes if they could establish legitimate connections to the property. The program not only helps former owners or tenants who remained in their houses after foreclosure, but also people who were scammed. But in this story, at least there's a happy ending. A man named Jerry Gumbert decided he would pay for the house so Walker could stay. However, the process was far from easy, involving months of paperwork and negotiations with the corporate owner in Florida. As news of the donor's involvement spread, the price of the house magically increased, since greed knows no bounds. But in the end, the house is June's. This is what happens when female psychopaths start scamming. Let's get right into it. Number 4. City girls behind city bars. Before City Girls, singer JT was known as Jatavia Johnson, a Miami girl who came from nothing. Hailing from a bad neighborhood, JT was among the youngest of 16 brothers and sisters. After she reached 7th grade, JT was put out on her own, sometimes staying with an aunt and other times crashing at friends' houses. JT had various day jobs from Whole Foods to Burger King, always working, but still struggling to make ends meet. Getting fed up with the life she had, JT used a handful of stolen credit card numbers to buy clothes and various gift cards she felt she deserved. JT showed off this time of her life in photos she posted on her social media. Gifts for her niece, a digital camera for a vacation, makeup artists for night outs with the girls. She was eventually arrested in June of 2017 at a Nordstrom after buying a pair of shoes. Shortly after her arrest, JT and the other half of City Girls, Young Miami, were discovered by hip-hop label Quality Control. And by Christmas, City Girls had released their first official single, a song we're not going to repeat. We're pretty sure this song isn't going to challenge Mariah Carey for most played song at Christmas anytime soon. Also released around the same time was Where the Bag At, a song about demanding money, where JT repeats deeply poetic lines describing that she needs someone, quote, who gonna swipe them visas? This likely didn't help her case. JT pled guilty to aggravated identity theft and was sentenced to 24 months in federal prison. Her lawyer provided a schedule of upcoming City Girl shows leading up to a major appearance at the BET Awards in June of that year, so the judge agreed to push back JT's surrender date. Then, a week before she was set to go in, JT's lawyer requested another delay on account of a recent co-sign with Canada's favorite son, Drake, leaning into the fact that JT was a rising superstar in the hip-hop industry. The requested extension wasn't fully granted, but JT was permitted to perform at the award show and finish her verse for Drake. After completing her commitments, JT honored her sentence and showed up to serve her time. JT began her prison term in July 2018 and was set to be released on March 1st, 2020. In the meantime, City Girls continued to release singles and tracks with the other half of the group, Young Miami, doing everything she could to promote their music. In an attempt to get an early release, JT argued her good behavior for over a year should qualify her, leaving about 8.5 months of her sentence remaining. While the request was denied, JT was transferred to a halfway house 5 months before her scheduled release, allowing her to continue her career. Since her incarceration and release, JT has amassed a net worth of $1.5 million. That net worth mostly comes from the group's high appearance fees. They charge $40,000 for TV appearances and $15,000 for nightclub appearances. Looks like she found a new way to rip people off. Number 3, her mantra was to steal. Amanda Knorr, 35, was one of 3 people charged over a green energy scheme that defrauded over 300 investors. Knorr and her college boyfriend, Troy Ragg, founded Mantracore. Knorr's company, Mantra, focused on green community development, socially responsible investing, distressed real estate fund management, mortgage banking, renewable energy, music and entertainment, and philanthropy. So pretty much everything. The couple received more than $54 million from hundreds of investors within 4 years based on promises of technology that would turn trash into fuel and carbon-negative housing developments, neither of which were ever fully developed. Mantracore is known as the largest green energy scam the U.S. has ever seen. Many victims lost their entire life savings. Mantra was a Ponzi scheme in which new investor money was used to pay earnings to prior investors, often without any actual product being sold. Mantra's pitch was centered primarily around a venture to produce biochar and a green real estate development in Tennessee. Biochar is a charcoal-like substance made by burning organic material in a process called pyrolysis. Biochar was supposed to take waste like used tires and household garbage and convert it into an energy source and a fertilizer. By spreading this stuff all over your field, it could pull toxins out of the atmosphere. Noor and Rag were both honored by former President Bill Clinton, a real pillar of morality himself, during a 2009 ceremony for the Clinton Global Initiative for their plans to develop biochar technology that they said would sequester carbon dioxide and reduce emissions in developing countries. Noor and Rag lied to investors, along with Colorado wealth advisor Wade McKelvey. McKelvey ran get-rich-quick seminars to pitch their biochar technology and a carbon-negative housing development in Tennessee. Through his Speed of Wealth seminars, one featuring John Elway, McKelvey overstated claims that Mantra had already made millions of dollars and promised investment returns as high as 484%. McKelvey specifically targeted elderly investors and taught them how to liquidate all their assets, such as mutual funds and 401k plans, then told them to take out as many loans as possible and invest it all in Mantra. Many of them did. However, Mantra's environmental initiatives hadn't been profitable. Biochar is very expensive to produce, and Mantra only had one plant that was just starting out, not the claimed 25. The housing development wasn't anything more than vacant lots resold at a loss, and the early returns paid to investors had been funded almost exclusively from new investments. So where did all these retirees' life savings go? Rag claims he didn't spend lavishly, despite the influx of millions to their company, merely living in a 1,200 square foot home, and said there was no Lamborghini parked out front. He was, however, driving around in a Mercedes SLK 350 with a Mantra vanity license plate. Granted, it's not an elite luxury vehicle, but it's not a Honda Civic either. Along with funding their lifestyles, there was the creation of Mantra Records, a record label that invested money in a rapper called Ice Block. Mantra Records funded a music video for Ice Block that ridiculously featured Rag and Noor. A lawsuit was able to recover about $6 million for victims of the scheme. Another $800,000 was placed in a receivership but has yet to be paid out. Of the $54 million invested in Mantra, $17 million have been paid out to early investors. But when the Securities Exchange Commission shut Mantra down, only $790,000 remained from the other $37 million. Noor and Rag both pled guilty after being charged. While out on bail, waiting for his sentence, Rag hatched another scheme where he solicited an investment in an online video dating service that was about to be purchased by a well-known entrepreneur. Of course, there was no deal, and the victim lost her entire investment. Troy Rag was deemed a continued threat to the public and received a harsher sentence of 22 years in prison and $54 million restitution. Wade McKelvey was sentenced to 18 years in prison, 5 years of supervised release, in order to pay $37 million restitution. Amanda Noor was sentenced in Philadelphia federal court to only 30 months in federal prison in order to pay $37 million restitution. Maybe these three should invest in a little morality. Number 2. Give me your tax returns. Tanya M. Fox spent $4 million on a BMW 7 Series, an Infiniti M35, a Chrysler Crossfire, Volkswagen Beetle, and a Maserati, 2 cosmetic surgeries, and she opened a restaurant in Orlando, Florida. But Fox didn't earn her $4 million the old-fashioned way our fathers and grandfathers did, by playing the state lottery. She actually opened bank accounts in the name of fake tax prep businesses to file for fraudulent returns, then used other people to withdraw those returns. Fox filed over 3,590 false tax returns on behalf of 3,023 different victims. Fox used social security numbers, dates of birth, and names of patients, most of whom were teenagers, at the health department to file the returns and obtain nearly $4.1 million. 2 health department employees, Shantarisha Smith and Gerald Williams, and Williams' brother Delray Duncan, were arrested, admitting that they were paid roughly $45,000 to steal patients' information. The investigation started when sheriffs were searching a house and discovered a handwritten list with about 150 names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. During her trial, Fox was deemed the mastermind behind the scheme, given the more severe punishment of 20 years for aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy, as well as theft of government property. While the sentence was viewed by some as harsh, the judge brought up the aggravating factor of bribing 3 members of the health department to get her hands on the identities. Further, the majority of the stolen identities belong to teenagers who will be unaware that their identities have been stolen and the problems that will create until they try to buy a house or a car in the future. All of Fox's assets were seized in order to pay restitution. Her co-conspirator, Gerald Williams, received 4.5 years, Delray Duncan got 3.5, and Shantarika Smith was sentenced to 5 years. Number 1. Queen Tax Fraud. Rashia Wilson was the self-proclaimed queen of IRS tax fraud. Apparently, tax fraud has a monarchy. She posted a message on Facebook in all capital letters for emphasis, claiming that she's a millionaire. For the record, so if we had thought the police indicting her would be easy, it wouldn't be. Honestly, we thought it would have been easy. Wilson promised us that we need more than, quote, black and white to hold her down. That was the message to the rat who went and told on her, although her meaning still seems a bit vague. Wilson's post goes on in disbelief about the police's possible indictment plans, as if the First Lady, so wait, now she's not a queen? Didn't have the Tampa Bay Police Department under her spell. Wait, she's a witch now? Her Majesty reminded us that at the moment she ran Tampa, so she wouldn't have to do any time. But Wilson obviously meant no time other than the 21 years she had gotten for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and being a felon, queen, witch, in possession of a firearm. From April 2009 to September 2012, Queen and First Lady Rashia Wilson and her co-conspirator Maurice J. Larry ran a scheme to defraud the Internal Revenue Service by fraudulently obtaining tax refunds. They received U.S. Treasury checks and prepaid debit cards that were loaded with funds derived from filing false income tax returns in other people's names. Wilson and Larry filed these tax returns from various locations, including Wilson's own home and various hotels throughout Tampa. Wilson and Larry then used these refunds to make hundreds of thousands of dollars in retail purchases, to buy money orders, and to withdraw cash. During the unpredicted investigation, agents searched Wilson's house and Larry's storage unit, where they discovered thousands of names and social security numbers. Agents also found high-end accessories, jewelry, and a firearm in Wilson's home. Further, additional reloadable debit cards loaded with fraudulent tax refunds were found in both locations. Wilson, who often referred to herself as the First Lady and Queen of Tax Fraud, title she chose for herself, spent $30,000 on her daughter's first birthday party and had purchased a new Audi for $90,000. The IRS estimated that the actual loss from Wilson and Larry's scheme was $2,240,096.39, though the royal couple's potential theft was in excess of $11 million. At her trial, Wilson's defense brought in a psychologist who explained that she suffers from bipolar disorder that was first diagnosed from a young age, and that the absurd bragging is consistent with her disorder. Wilson had a rough upbringing, struggled in school, and eventually dropped out. However, the judge couldn't ignore the fact that Wilson stole over $3 million from the government. An unfortunate upbringing with a mental disorder didn't give her a pass. The judge sentenced Rashia Wilson to 21 years in federal prison for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and being a felon in possession of a firearm, as well as the forfeiture of $2,240,096.39, which constitutes the proceeds traceable to the offense. This was quite an unusually hefty sentence for the amount of money she had stolen. In fact, a petition was set up on change.org calling for a lesser sentence for her. It probably didn't help her case that she chose to scam the government and that she talked trash while doing it. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comment section what you think is the worst dating app to use.